Welcome to episode 119 of Stageworthy. I'm your host, Phil Rickaby. Stageworthy is a podcast about people in Canadian theatre featuring conversations with actors, directors, playwrights, and more. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I would like to remind you, as I often do, that subscribing is the best way to make sure you never miss an episode of Stageworthy. And there are, as I always say, but it is true, there are some great episodes coming up, so trust me when I tell you that you don't want to miss them. So make sure that you subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Music or on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get every episode of Stageworthy delivered right to your device. And if you want to drop me a line, you can find Stageworthy on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at StageworthyPod, and you can find the website at stageworthypodcast.com. And if you want to drop me a line, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Phil Rickaby, and my website is philrickaby.com. My guest this week is Asitha Tennekoon, who appears in Canadian stages The Overcoat, starting March 27th and running until April 14th at Toronto's Bluma Appel Theatre. So I come from a theater background.
Okay.
I don't have a whole lot of an opera background.
Gotcha.
I've seen a couple.
Yep.
But one of the things that I'm always fascinated by are the things that draw people to the performance art. And so what was your first exposure to opera, and how did you decide that that's what you were going to do?
So I didn't see my very first full-scale opera production until I was 22 when I started my undergrad a little bit later at Indiana University. But the way I kind of got into it was when I was younger, I started off singing in the chapel choir at the school I went to in Sri Lanka. So I grew up in Sri Lanka. I started singing in the chapel choir there, and that's where I really started to love vocal music. It was choral music for the most part, Anglican tradition, all of that. And that's where I first realized that music and singing was going to be a big part of my life. And then when I was 15, my mom forced me to take voice lessons, private voice lessons. Basically, I was kicking and screaming. I was like, no, I don't want to do it. But she basically put her foot down and said I had to. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll go in for one lesson. And that's it. And she was like, fine, go in for one lesson, see if you like it, whatever. And so I go in, and the teacher whom I went to, she had seen me perform at a school event, basically, and had spoken to my mom and said, if you ever want to send him in for lessons, I'd be happy to help out. She heard me, and on that day, she took out an application form for the concerto competition that the Symphony Orchestra in Sri Lanka was holding, and it was the day before the application deadline, and I was like, sure, fill it out. Yeah. And I enjoyed the lesson, but I still didn't have an idea of, okay, I'm going to keep doing this. So I was like, if you want to fill it out, fill it out. And I kept going for lessons. I ended up winning that competition, the vocal category of that competition. I was 15 at this point, and it kind of took off from there as far as solo singing was concerned. And I really haven't stopped doing it since then.
Do you have a sense of what your mother saw that made her decide that even though this child says that he doesn't want to do this, that I'm going to make him go to this lesson?
I played piano from the time I was 6 years old, which again was thanks to my mom's influence. And because she's a piano teacher herself, but she was smart enough to refuse to teach me because she knew that I'd just be a tough student, her being my mother and all that. But I think the feedback... Oh, hello.
Some extra sound effects.
Yeah. The feedback she had received from people who'd heard me sing probably encouraged her and gave her an idea of, okay, he has a good natural gift that she would have liked me to develop. And I think that's what kind of pushed her to to put her foot down. And she also comes from a very musical background herself. Like I said, she's a piano teacher.
Yeah.
And she was involved with that growing up. And I think for her part too, she had to work hard herself and fend for herself in a way to do all of the piano exams and all that she'd done. So she'd had, she'd worked really hard for it. And I think she appreciated it, and she really knew that I wasn't aware enough to really appreciate whatever gift she saw was that I had.
If it was your mother teaching you, you would have a very different relationship than with a teacher that was not your parent.
I think so, yeah.
So hearing about your going, you went to the contest and then this, that, and the other thing. When did you fall in love with singing? Enough that it was going to become what you would go to study and you would make it your life.
Right. It kind of happened in steps. So the chapel choir I was in, our choral director, Mr. Bartholomew's, he was self-taught, and he had this amazing approach to how he taught us in the choir itself. He would always use whatever music we were singing and equate it to life events or everyday things that we would do and how we would express the music. He'd always draw from what we saw around. There was one instance, I don't know why this is the first thing that comes to my mind, but just outside of the chapel there was a quadrangle, and they would mow the grass on there, and sometimes while we were rehearsing we'd smell the grass being cut and all that, and he pulled from that and said, this section of the music needs to sound like you're taking in a breath of that and like smelling in the and just different things that resonated with me at the time. He'd been doing it for years. He's probably one of the most beloved people who's ever taught there. And he was an English teacher as well, so he had that way with language, and he was really influential in my discovering music, but also discovering how to use language in singing and vocalizing as well.
Sure. So where did you think that road was going to take you, and how did you, like you said that you didn't discover opera until much later, and so how did you discover opera and decide to make that your focus?
So I'd sung a few arias from operas in my voice lessons and things like that, but when I finished high school, I took a few years off, a year or so, to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And living in Sri Lanka, being a musician, and especially a classical musician, would have been a hard profession to make a living out of there. So lots of people who are musicians there, they either teach full time or they have other professions, other jobs that that's their main focus. So I started doing a law degree, and I did about a year of it, and a year into it I decided, if I'm going to put in this kind of financial investment into my education, why don't I try auditioning for a few schools overseas and see what happens if I get in, depending on if I can get some sort of scholarship and things like that. I was like, I'm going to regret this if I don't at least try, because I know that this is something that's important to me. My first love, if I had the option to even do it in Sri Lanka, would have been to go straight into music, and I was only doing the law because that was becoming a professional musician wasn't really an option. And so I sent in applications, auditioned for 5 schools in the U.S., and got into Indiana University with an almost full scholarship. So that really opened my eyes to, okay, people kind of see that I'm capable of doing something, obviously. And that encouraged me a lot as well, to be like, okay, this is where I'm going to head in. And we had never had a full-scale opera performed in Sri Lanka, at least not during my lifetime up to that point. So when I went in, and the first production I watched at Indiana University was Rigoletto. And it's a massive opera school. They do 6 to 7 productions a year, double cast, 4 performances each. So the sets were amazing, the costumes were amazing, and I still remember my first the first thing I saw as soon as the music began, with the curtains opening and this really extravagant set. And yeah, that was definitely a moment I was like, I am where I feel like I really belong.
Yeah.
So,
had you, when you decided you were going to study law, did you have a passion for the law at all, or was that just the thing that you were supposed to do?
It was a topic of interest for me.
Okay.
I think when I finished my education, my high school education, we have advanced level exams. So we have ordinary level exams, and then after that, for 2.5 to 3 years, you study for your advanced level exams. And I was in the arts stream.
Sure.
So lots of students in the arts stream end up getting into law or something else connected to the arts even. But law was an option because I knew lots of musicians who were lawyers as well.
Okay.
And I was also part of the debating team in school. I had done a lot of, drama and stuff like that. And debating especially was something that I found exciting and I was really interested in. And I was trying to find, okay, these are my interests and this is what I like doing. What is a potential occupation that I could get into? And law kind of made sense for that reason.
Neat. When you started going into when you got to the university, is there something that surprised you about the way that they taught singing? Was there a lesson that you had to learn or things that you had to unlearn?
There was a lot. My first teacher there, Brian Horn, he was so instrumental with kind of building up my technique. Because at that point, I'd just been singing and not really thinking a lot about technique. And he really broke it down for me and built my technique from scratch. There wasn't a whole lot I had to unlearn, but applying certain things, thinking about things in a different way, thinking about sensations, where my voice is coming from, where do I feel it resonate, how is it, understanding that what I'm hearing while I'm singing is not the same thing that someone else is hearing. So there was a lot of that I had to get my head around. And I think and the other side of it was how large the school was and how many singers there were, and hearing all these different voices and you hear what was it? I can't remember how many students there were, but definitely more solo voices I'd heard than ever before in my life. And even as a tenor, that was where I learned, there's not just one kind of tenor voice. There's different fachs, if you will, within each voice part too, and trying to figure out, okay, so then where do I fit in? What does that mean for my voice? So there was a lot to learn, and there was a lot to explore, but it was a really great environment for that.
The idea that what you are hearing as you're singing is not what other people are hearing, I think, is not something that I've really thought of before. And I think a lot of people, because they haven't been trained in that, have not thought of that.
Right.
How did that change the way that you sing?
You learn how to go by sensation. And that's why for singers it's very helpful, obviously, to have your voice teacher, you have your vocal coach, and you have, sometimes if you're able to, you have different people to go to for different repertoire. For if you're preparing an Italian piece, you have someone who's stronger with that you go to and sing for. And so you start to learn, and you record your lessons and all of that. And so you listen back and try and remember, okay, at this point, what were my sensations? What was I doing with, my soft palate? How was that working? Because we use all that space inside for resonance and everything. And learning to trust the sensations as opposed to what you're getting back. Okay. And that helps a lot, especially if we're singing. So we don't use microphones or anything when we sing. So if you're in a hall that is heavily carpeted and you don't have any feedback whatsoever,
right?
It's easy to oversing if that's what you're listening for. If you're listening for the resonance as opposed to feeling the resonance, that makes a huge difference.
Okay.
So
So you from Sri Lanka to the U.S.
Right.
to Canada.
I went back home to Sri Lanka for about a year and a half in between.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what was the draw for Canada? What brought you back here?
So after my undergrad, I went back to Sri Lanka because I hadn't been home in about 3 years.
That's a good reason to
Plus,
go.
yeah. Plus, I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue on a career path of voice, because I think one of the other things I learned in my studying in the States was how difficult the career itself is.
Oh, sure.
And how, it takes time to build it up. As a tenor, as a male singer as well, your voice is going to mature a lot later. So can I take that amount of time that's necessary? Am I just going to be stuck without making anything? And I went home to try and figure all that out, to try and figure out what my next step was going to be. And halfway through my time in Sri Lanka, after the States, was when I decided, okay, I'm going to go forward with this. I'm going to make it work somehow. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to continue studying because I wanted to have that background, develop that background of having regular lessons, taking classes. But I also wanted to be in a place that was more of a city where I could work at the same time in singing.
Sure.
And that was one of the reasons I looked at Canada. For whatever reason, I still can't pinpoint why I didn't want to go back to the States. I didn't look like a place that I wanted to settle down.
Sure.
Eventually. So I was looking at that as well. And I ended up here at the Royal Conservatory at the Glenn Gould School. Nice. They were extremely generous as well, gave me a full scholarship to be here. So ended up here.
Nice. And I mean, as somebody, a lot of people who listen to the podcast are theater people, and we don't have a lot of visibility into what the life of an opera singer is like, and why you might have had some trepidation or worry about what a career after school might look like. What does that look like?
It's different for everyone, and I'm sure there's a lot that translates into what theater students go through as well after they're done. You basically get into the whole hustle of auditioning, and you end up taking whatever jobs you can take to fill in the time, but then also trying to find the time to practice, trying to find a space to practice in. Very often, you have to have a piano, or you have to have a space where sometimes people don't like it if you practice in your apartment. Your landlords don't like it or something like that. So there's a lot of that needs to be taken into consideration. And so, and even when you start off with the gigs, a lot of the gigs that you start off with right out of school aren't the best paying gigs. You start off, you do, if someone is like, I'm doing this thing, would you like to be a part of it? You're like, yes. Because at that point, you haven't had any singing projects. Sure. You've been like working at wherever, and then all of a sudden this thing comes up and you're like, it's a lot of balancing, because it's like you want to have a steady income, but you also need to have a job that's flexible enough where they're like, okay, we'll let you go do this singing project that you want to do. So there's a lot of those challenges that come into it.
So we're here. We mentioned earlier. You're just this is the first day of tech for the Overcoat with the Canadian stage, and the Overcoat is based on a short story by Nikolai Gogol. And I've read it. It was a long time ago that I read it. So it's about a guy who finds an expensive coat, and it changes his life until he loses it, which changes his life again. Is that basically?
That would basically be it.
Were you familiar with the story of the Overcoat beforehand?
Not really. We did a couple of workshops on the piece, so that was my first exposure to it. But prior to that, no, I didn't know anything about the story.
Were you familiar with any of the? Had you heard of Nikolai Gogol before?
Nope.
I don't think that's uncommon.
Right.
He's not necessarily known outside of Russia, except to some people who like absurdist things, and that's one of the things that he's kind of known for.
Yeah.
Is sort of an absurdist look at, the world. And you're playing the
manager and also the secretary to the important personage.
Okay. And what does the manager do in the play?
My arc is basically I'm the manager of this department, but there's someone else who's above me as well, the boss, the head of the department, if you will. And for the manager, he's this guy who's trying to control everybody, but also trying to make sure people aren't doing more work than is necessary, in the sense of his relationship with Akaki, our protagonist, is that, Akaki loves numbers and he loves to work on them, and he does a lot of work at the department. And so my character's like, you doing all this work makes us look really horrible. Yes. So what's the deal? And so he kind of tries to rule these 4 people under him with an iron fist, but also is very beholden to the head of the department.
Sure.
That's basically the manager's kind of how his entrance is set up for the piece.
And that's kind of like, that's the Gogol was writing during Tsarist Russia at a time of great bureaucracy and where status was everything. So it would have been very important for the manager to make sure that he kept his status, and everybody below him could not rise above him, because he could not rise above the people above him. So it was very, very tenuous.
Exactly. And there's also a very going along with that mindset. There's a very Groundhog Day sort of feeling to it too. So you see all these people going about their lives, but it's always the same day.
Sure.
And everyone has a place in society. Everyone has the things that they are expected to do, nothing more, nothing less than that. And that, to me, is why it's so interesting to see this character, Akaki, who's he's the only person on stage you see has like a love for something and wants to explore his love for numbers, his love for the work he does. I think it's set up really well, and I think Morris has done a really great job with how he's come up with the libretto for it. And James, the composer, it's so amazing. I still remember when I was preparing the music for the first workshop, I would listen to it and play it out, and I'd be like, there's some really weird things in here. And you meet Morris for the first time, and you're like, oh, all the quirks make sense. And it's amazing that James, I think, has been able to get in, he's basically laid out in music form what I feel is going on in Morris's head when he thinks about how he wanted this scene to go, how he wanted, this scene to be, the arc of each scene to go. So.
And how long, you mentioned that there have been some workshops of this before.
Right.
So how long have you been involved in the production?
I've been involved with this for about a year and a half, on and off. So we do a week of workshops. I think the first workshop that I was involved in, it was just all music. We just went through the music, sang through it, worked on, what could we change, what could, what could be developed even more. And then the second workshop, which must have been a few months or a year after that, was with Morris, and we staged a few scenes. And then thereafter it was here that we started working on it as a production itself. The show as a whole started off in 2014 when Morris was a part of LibLab with Tapestry Opera. And LibLab is this thing they do over the course of a few days where they put librettists together with composers. They have to come up with a certain number of scenes in a very limited amount of time. And I hope I'm getting this story correct, but what Morris was working with a composer who had to leave on the last day or something like that, and James, who was mentoring some of the composers, decided, okay, I'll step in and work with Morris. And that's when Morris was like, I kind of want to see if I can use one of these scenes from the Overcoat that he'd done at that point, probably 16 years prior, and work on a libretto for it and see how that scene would come up. And I think it's the scene between the tailor and his wife and Akaki that they put together. And when they performed it at the end of that LibLab session, I think that's when Michael Mori at Tapestry Opera saw it, and he thought this needs to be made into full-scale opera.
It's interesting because the first time I heard that Can Stage was doing the Overcoat, I remembered the production from 16 years ago, right, or however long.
20, I think. At this point, I think. I'm not sure.
People talking about a very physical piece, and everybody I knew just having their minds blown about like this just simple choreography and all this movement and things like that. And that seemed to be what people were talking about in my circles anyway.
Right.
And I wondered when I first heard what the connection was between the two. And it figures that it's Morris trying to take it further.
Right.
So I think that a lot of people don't think of opera as funny.
Right.
And Gogol is almost always funny because that's the best way to show the ridiculousness and the tragedy of Russian life that he was trying to get across. Now, of course, there are comedic operas like The Merry Wives of Windsor and others. What's your reaction to the comedy in the Overcoat?
I think with the reason, just to take a step back from it, there's obviously a very, stereotypical response from the larger public to opera itself. And
we always see it as very serious.
Right, exactly. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that, there are these people endlessly singing, using huge voices on stage, and
often not in English, which is something that can separate, right?
Often not in English. And also, I think from the part of the performers, sometimes what gets lost is this idea of being present and telling a story on stage. Because there's so much focus on the singing, and I want to make sure everything coming out of my mouth is perfectly in place, that the resonance is just where it needs to be, that the beauty is there. And so there's a lot of that gets lost, that becomes secondary, which I think I'm finding working with a lot of the indie opera companies in Toronto. There's a lot that they're focusing on changing that attitude towards it, to making the vocal stuff is always going to be important.
Yes.
But trying to make, telling a story, making sure everyone is present, making sure there's reactions on stage, which sounds stupid to say.
It's funny because I remember years ago when I was in theater school, there was a gentleman who was staying in the house that I was in. He'd just come in for a little while. He was working for a little while with the Canadian Opera Company.
Okay.
And he came back from his first day of rehearsal, and he was like, well, this guy, he has a great voice, but we are going to have to tell him how to move everything because he is just a rod on stage, which I think speaks to how at the time opera was performed without acting, without reacting, and without
there's
interaction.
This whole thing called park and bark that we use for fun, hopefully for fun in opera, where it's like, you have this big thing to sing, so you're going to stand in one place, make sure your body is aligned, everything's set, and you're just going to do that. And I don't think there's been any room for that in the last so many years, for good reason, because that's not interesting.
No,
because if you're singing, if you have a beautiful voice, great. if you're singing and your breath control and all that is amazing, great, but that's only going to keep an audience captured for
that's the kind of thing, like, if I wanted to hear that as an audience member, there are plenty of recordings that I can go to where I can hear that. I think, one of the things that maybe, which is what's important about the indie opera companies with an emphasis on this, is to change the way that people are thinking about opera.
I think Toronto's, that's one of the things that I see very special about Toronto, is the fact that you have all these smaller companies trying to change what opera is, trying to change the boundaries of it. And especially with this show, like, it's not just an opera. It's not just a theater production. It's not just a movement piece. It's something... The most exciting thing for me about it is that it doesn't fall into any of these boxes. And they're creating something new. I mean, you don't have these large arias that one person just sings forever and ever that you would find in opera. There's all these moving parts. One of the challenges, I think, for the singers has been trying to incorporate all the movement into it, trying to make sure we move on this beat. It's funny, Morris mentioned in rehearsal a few days ago, he was like, in the same way that you would learn the perfect note at the perfect time so that it comes out, you sing the right note at the right time, that's how specific I want all of you to be with your movements. So that if you're going to move your hand, it needs to be at this spot that we've decided on, and to just concentrate on that, which is a new thing for opera singers, I think, is we think about that specificity with the music, but not always with our movement.
Has that been a difficult thing to incorporate?
Not particularly difficult. It's a new thing. Wendy Gorling is working with us on a lot of the movement stuff, and she really makes sure we get our movement down exactly where it needs to be, and it's been really eye-opening for me working with her as well. And we have a couple of guys who were on the original Overcoat, Colin Heath and Courtney Stevens. Just watching them in every scene they're in, they have no vocal part. They're in there, but they're so on the money every single time. And I think that's one of the exciting things about regular theater that I would love to see come into the opera world.
Did you personally have difficulty with the movement, or
not really?
No, that's good.
You get a note from Wendy or Morris, and then if you're not on stage or not in the scene, you kind of work on it while they're off it. You write it down, and you kind of explore different aspects of how you would. And like every good director, Morris and Wendy have asked us for specific kind of, this is what I want, this is the kind of thing I want you to do, but they've also given us the freedom to explore within that. Okay, what's the best way that would work for me? No, it's been, if I had to call it a challenge, it's been the best kind of challenge. And that's the environment you want to be in. That's the kind of environment you want to work in. That's why this stuff is so exciting, is you're pushing your own boundaries and you're discovering new things for yourself. And having all that feedback from the people who are directing as well.
But because it's difficult to think of this as opera, because I think that's not something that I think of for Canadian stage. Like, when I think of Canadian stage, I don't think, opera.
Right.
I don't usually even think, musicals or anything like that. So that it sort of makes it an interesting and different aspect of the Canadian stage's season.
I hope by the end of the run that people will learn to look at, because there is this idea of, okay, this is what opera is.
Sure.
And this is very different from any opera that I would ever have attended. But it still falls into that genre in a broader sense as well, while also expanding the boundaries of what opera is. And I hope people go away with it thinking, opera isn't this thing where we have to dress up and know something about the show before going into it and all that.
I would really hope so. I mean, for myself, that's always been a barrier to going to opera, is like it seems all very serious and formal, and that if I don't have a clean suit, that I'll be stared
Right.
like, what will be the reaction? Like, it's just so, it seems like a foreign thing.
Yeah. Because I've worked with a few of the indie opera companies, I can say, you know, a lot of them do their performances. Sometimes there's a La Boheme that's done in a bar or in different settings, and that's made it much more accessible. You know, you can go in just wearing jeans and a shirt, get a beer, get in an opera. Sometimes done in English, where, you know, they've translated it and they've done it that way as well. And there's a lot of that's changing that I'm really excited about.
Well, because it's interesting, because that's the other thing is I've heard some people, and I don't even know if this is true, but they've said, oh, you know, even if you speak Italian and you go to an Italian opera, you won't have a clue what they're saying and things like that. But in translating to English, does that remove the need for surtitles and things like that? Or?
Sometimes.
Yeah?
I think it's more immediate when you have it in English. Of course, you have I've come across really bad translations, translated versions, but I've come across some very good ones as well. Because if you have the surtitles, you have, you know, you usually have the entire line while this guy's still singing it. So that immediacy of what the music does is kind of lost, because I already know what he's going to say.
Yeah.
Whereas when it's in English, you're not necessarily following the surtitles, even if they have them, because you can actually understand and you can watch what's going on stage, and that immediacy of being in the exact second a certain word comes out, you know, you're there with the person who's singing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you see something like a Stephen Sondheim musical, which often is sung through, you don't need the subtitles, because you can follow along and experience it with the character, so you don't need that. Right. Yeah. Is there something that you're particularly excited about for an audience to see what you've been, this thing? Is there anything that like really excites you?
There are so many moments in this piece that I think are very cool. It's always working. It's like a clock. I mean, if you're watching the show from start to finish, there's something that's always moving. And I find that fascinating, especially as an opera singer, because traditionally it's, okay, you sing your thing, you're done. You're still present in the scene, but whoever else is singing their aria, they take the spotlight.
Sure.
You don't do anything to kind of do too much. Whereas here, you know, someone's singing, the story's still going on, there's a lot happening, there's so many other characters on stage, and it's more like watching something happening in reality, but with the frame of the absurdist kind of mindset to it as well. But yeah, I'm excited for people to see how they've taken, you know, what was done 20 years ago. And what I love is that Morrison, Wendy haven't tried to replicate what's happened. They were extremely clear from day one that they wanted to take it and make it something new, something where they incorporate the music, they incorporate opera singers, they incorporate the movement, but come up with something that is brand new compared to what they did earlier.
That's true. I mean, I can see the temptation. I mean, I would be tempted to be like, I kind of just want to do what we did before, but and it takes a certain amount of bravery to go, we have new, like everything is new, we can't possibly do what we did before, so let's throw it open. But still sort of like have elements of that.
Exactly.
It sounds, from the way that that you're describing it, that there's a certain amount of spectacle to watching this, just with the constant movement and things like that. Which I think is not particularly something that people expect. I mean, an opera, often they're known for like the lavish set. Right. But often the idea that I have is people come out onto this set and they stand there and they watch somebody else sing, and then it's the chorus's turn and they'll do some movement and then they stop and things like that.
Right. And that lends itself, obviously, to this story in particular as well, because there's all these things that are always happening.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that you have this one character, Akaki, in the middle of all the regular bustle of life, having his own story. But that is something new for me, and I think for the rest of the cast too, as opera singers, is we can't ever, this sounds very silly to say, but we can't ever switch off. Because there's always, I'm supposed to take this table over here now. Sure. This table needs to go off. I mean, it's not just take the table out, stage left. You're still taking there's a very specific movement involved with your character. And Wendy's she's done an amazing job bringing in specifics to, your character would not go and move this way. And there's always, there's a very circular element to everything and how everything happens. And I can't wait to try and incorporate some of that into my work on, a full-scale regular opera, which is one of the things I've learned a lot about in this process for this show.
So you think that working on this show has changed the way that you might approach another show?
Oh, definitely. There isn't as much involvement for the other characters on the stage, usually. I don't want to speak in general terms. I'm sure there's an opera director somewhere who's done this. But where, someone's singing and they have the main sort of focus of the audience and all of that. But the other people in the background aren't really doing a whole lot. So here it's like my character's still invested in doing these other things in the background and doing all of that. And it sounds silly saying it, but it's not. There are lots of aspects of it that are new in the sense of I'm not only making this character my own through my vocal singing, I'm also making this character my own in the way I physicalize him, in the way I move my body. And that's something that doesn't often get talked about in opera, because your physical body and your physical presence and your posture, all of that needs to be a certain way in order to produce sound in a healthy manner. But I think we can afford to play around a little bit within that that setting of, as long as I'm sure that my body is the way I need it to be to feel comfortable, I can still play around with other aspects of my character in a physical sense. That, in my experience, doesn't always happen.
Has finding the balance between that physical presence, the posture, and the movement of the character been a challenge? Was that a new thing to try to play with?
It was a fairly new thing for me to play with. There was one character I play a doctor towards the end of the show, and there was a certain physicality that Wendy wanted me to play around with, which I found was constricting for me vocally, because I had to kind of scrunch my shoulders up in, and that felt uncomfortable. So I talked to her, and she was really helpful with trying to help me find something that still brought out what she wanted from the character, but also in a way that felt comfortable for me vocally as well. Which is another, interesting thing. It's you learn where your body's boundaries are for the important thing, which is the singing, but also making sure that the presentational aspects of the acting and the character aren't lost in the process.
It sounds like it's been a lot of... how long has this rehearsal process been for this?
We started on the 27th of... What month is it? We started on the 27th of February, I think, I believe, yeah.
So it'll be almost a month. Well, more than a month.
Yeah, just about a month, yeah.
Is that normal for an opera?
I would say 4 to 5 weeks is usually how much time we have to put something up.
I mean, speaking from a theater world where it's often 2 weeks and you're up.
Right.
And how many times I've been if we only had 2 more weeks.
Yeah.
To have that. What is happening at those rehearsals over the month?
So usually you'd have a lot of those rehearsals in the first week be music rehearsals,
Sure.
where you're just going through the music, singing it. And it's been a little different with this because we've had a chance to work with Les Dalla, our conductor, before in the workshops, so we already know what he's looking for with some of the phrases in the music, with his ideas. But usually we'd have about a few days, 2 to 3 days of music rehearsals, where we sing through it, and then we go section by section, and the conductor will be like, okay, I want you to do this with this phrase, kind of work on that, and then we'd get into staging. With this, it's been a little different because we've already had some of the music beforehand, and worked with Les beforehand in the workshops and that process. So we started staging day one.
Oh, nice.
And because there's so much movement involved, there's Jeff Surratt, our lead, who's doing an amazing job. It's just inspiring watching him. He's in every scene.
Oh, wow.
But there's also other people involved. There are people who don't even say anything, but they come on stage, they do something, and then they go off stage. So because of all that involvement, it was important for us to start staging day one.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Are you on social media on the web at all?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you share your
sure.
Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle's probably Asitha Tennekoon, ASITHATENNEKOON, I believe. I tried to make everything my name, which would be the easy way for me to remember it.
Yeah.
And Instagram as well.
Yeah. Do you have a website or
no?
Well,
okay. I'm on my agent's website.
Okay.
Kathy Domini. Yeah, dominiartists.com.
Great.
So.
Well, thank you so much for doing this today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me over here to chat about it.